Welcome to Moving Medicine Forward, a podcast presented by CTI Clinical Trial and Consulting Services. This podcast is centered on advancements in healthcare and elevating individual stories and their expertise. I'm your host, Jeremy Schran, and together with my co-host, Raina Graham,
hello,
we will take you through a deep dive of CTI, clinical research, the patient journey, and much more. Today on Moving Medicine Forward, we have two interviews. The first is with Dr. Rich Curry, a medical director with CTI. He will provide insights on the Bexion BXQ350 studies and how those trials have progressed over the last few months. In our second segment, we will talk with therapeutic leads Chad Jones and Katie Westerkamp about key insights into hematology and oncology research. Welcome in, Dr. Curry. It's great to see you. Great to have you on the podcast today.
Nice to see you, Jeremy. How are you?
Good. So we're going to start in today. We're talking about Bexion BXQ350. And so why was BXQ350 created, and what is the research history behind it?
The research history dates back over 20 years. There was a basic scientist at Cincinnati Children's Hospital that was in lysosomal storage disease. Those are conditions where one of the portions inside a cell goes awry and toxic products back up. So he had the idea to use one of the proteins that are in the lysosome to combat cancer. And in 2006, Dr. Ray Takagiku worked with Children's to use their technology there and develop BXQ350. BXQ350 is an IV formulation of a drug that uses a lysosomal protein known as sapsin C, and it packages it with some what are known as phospholipids, which are the type of lipids that are that make up the membrane of a cell, and created this nanovesicle, nano just meaning really small, and using it to attract cancer cells. And by bringing in this protein that triggers a reaction in the cell, we hope resulting in cancer death. So I think the genesis really is using a completely different disease from cancer, applying it to cancer and kind of running with it from there.
Yeah, and then so the trial is now also involving neuropathy and helping patients with that. Was that an initial thing, or by chance that came along as the trials were progressing?
So it was somewhat by chance. So the first human trial using BXQ350 started at 4 different centers in 2016. And as they were treating these patients, multiple investigators noticed that the patients were reporting back that their neuropathy was improving. Neuropathy is a general term that we use to signify dysfunction of nerves. So in this case, these patients had chemotherapy-induced neuropathy. So they had been treated for cancers in the past, and they, as a result of the cancer being attacked by chemo also attacks the nerve cells. So it's a very common occurrence. Maybe 25 to 40% of patients who are exposed to multiple chemotherapies will get neuropathy. And that will manifest in numbness and tingling in the hands and the feet, can be burning. Things can feel very uncomfortable to touch with temperature. So you pick up something cold, it hurts. It can affect patients' balance too. So this is something that they deal with as a consequence of the cancer therapy. During this first trial with BXQ350, patients were reporting that it was improving, and the investigators were not giving them any additional therapy for their neuropathy. They were just getting better. So they reported that back to Bexion in some of the conference calls, and there, we won't be able to get into it today, and I'm certainly not an expert in this, but that lysosomal protein that is being used for this drug has other research behind it that maybe it does affect other things outside of cancer in the lysosomes, one of which involved with neuropathic pain. And so that led Bexion to ask the question, well, could this drug be responsible for this improvement that patients have been experiencing? And it took a while, but they did open up another clinical trial that is testing this hypothesis. Is this drug able to reverse a chronic symptom such as chemo-induced neuropathy in patients? And that trial is open right now, trying to get started on answering that question.
Because right now it's not curable, is it?
No.
That's kind of a long-term effect
Correct.
from chemotherapy and other diseases, correct?
Sure. Yeah. So specifically about chemo-induced neuropathy, there are no cures for it. It is if someone's neuropathy from chemo lasts more than 6 months, it's almost certainly going to be permanent. And we use medications to mask the symptoms, and those medications then come with their own side effects. they're not particularly effective either. So those patients are dealing with a chronic condition. So that's what this is trying to answer in this trial. So other types of neuropathy, diabetes is the number one cause of neuropathy in the United States. That's not part of this trial, and that's not anything that right now we're studying. However, neuropathy is a really big problem for people.
How did CTI and Bexion become partners?
Yeah, I think a couple of reasons. I mean, you start with Covington. Both we're right down the street from one another. CTI is here. Bexion has been here for a number of years. There are a lot of connections between the two companies, and I think they both wanted to work together to help one another. This was really a local grown company for both CTI and Bexion. I mean, they're local stories. And some of the people who work at Bexion are prior CTI employees. I myself was consulting with Bexion, and now I'm a CTI employee. So everybody here is really in this together. And that's where it came from. I think the partnership has been very successful, and that's why it's continued for this many years.
So to expand on that, what is the history of the trial research and how has that progressed through various trials over the years?
The first clinical trial opened in 2016. It was at 4 centers. It enrolled adult patients with multiple different types of cancers. And after that trial was completed, they were able to determine what dose they wanted to use. They did the same type of trial for pediatric patients to figure out what would be the right dose for children. And then after that, they opened a trial for a specific type of brain cancer mainly in pediatrics and young adulthood known as diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma. Since that trial opened, we really understand that it's more of a diffuse midline glioma with a certain kind of mutation. But that trial is currently enrolling patients at Cincinnati Children's Hospital and 2 other centers where they get BXQ350 plus radiation. After that, Bexion opened a clinical trial for advanced colorectal cancer where they're using BXQ350 plus kind of a backbone of other chemotherapies for patients. And then most recently being the chemo-induced neuropathy trial where they're trying to reverse the chemo-induced neuropathy. So most of their trials has been anti-cancer, but also having a trial for anti-neuropathy.
Yeah, and then it kind of expands into our phase one unit where we're able to run the trial. And can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So what we did, what's very unique for clinical trials is we leverage two different parts of CTI, one of which is our clinical trial operating unit. That's who's worked with Bexion to run their trials. Bexion has a drug, but they don't have obviously the number of people or resources to run a whole trial. So that's why we work with them on that. They wanted to open their phase one trial at reversal of chemo-induced neuropathy. And we have a phase one center that's up in Norwood. So we had the idea, well, why don't we run the trial there or at least start it there? And that's what we've done. We have one of my partners, Dr. Maynard, who's a neurologist and an investigator there, is evaluating the patients and treating them there. And we're working on, executing the entire trial. So that's really unique that we're, doing it within the same company. But I think for Bexion, what's really nice about that is that they just have a continual pulse on it. It's right here. It's another way of giving back to the community that we're running it in the Cincinnati area. And it's been a lot of fun doing it that way. It's a little unconventional, but I think it's made us much more successful because of, I think, just the close-knit relationship we had with that. But that trial is open at our phase one center for patients who have breast cancer who have experienced neuropathy, and then for colorectal cancer who've experienced neuropathy. So we're really excited to see what turns out of this.
How many other sites are there?
Two more. So Ohio State is enrolling patients, and so is Vanderbilt. Yeah, some of the connections we have with them. And Ohio State, really, they were the investigators who were in the phase one trial for adult cancers that noticed that the neuropathy was improving. So that's been a really close partner of ours since those days, and they've really been integral into the entire trial.
Now, did those trials start with healthy patients, or did you go directly into patients who were experiencing neuropathy or cancer treatment?
Yeah. So in this trial in particular, in all the Bexion trials, they've only been with cancer patients. So the cancer therapy trials that they've had so far, and I can review those in a moment, have been geared for patients who have specific kind of cancers that you're trying to target. So because these are drugs, this is a biologic type of drug, meaning that it's made from living, proteins. And this is actually the protein itself is manufactured from E. coli. So that's how you make the protein. And when you deal with products like that, we don't go into healthy volunteers. So this one, in particular, the anti-cancer trials, and then now the CIPN trial, that's specifically for cancer patients affected with chemo-induced neuropathy. Our phase one center, like many other phase one centers, I would say the majority of phase one trials are in healthy volunteers, where you have a drug and you want to figure out, is it safe? What dose do we use? You can use limited doses in healthy volunteers for a lot of those studies. And a lot of common drugs that all of us have taken in our lives came through development that way. But this one specific is just for cancer patients.
Right. So that narrows down the patient population that you can, of course, have participate in this trial. So, what was the approach? And Jeremy, you kind of from the marketing perspective, what approach was taken to find these patients in this area, or do patients travel from other areas?
Oh yeah, so that was fun because I have no marketing experience, of course. So we worked with our marketing team here to figure out how can we get the word out about this trial, because there's lots of patients in the Cincinnati area who have chemo-induced neuropathy. The first step that I took is I reached out to fellow physician friends of mine who treat cancer patients, and when went out to them, they were very happy to hear about it, really wanted to help, and we gave them flyers that they could pass out to the patients and said if they have this type of neuropathy, have them call us. And we got a fair number of calls at the beginning, um, but after that initial excitement somewhat wore off, and we didn't get a lot of patients. We had to really get deeper on that, and that's when we went to our marketing team to say, how can we get the word out to the Cincinnati area, and really turn it over. Then Jeremy can tell you a little more about what we did, but it was extremely successful because I think at the time that we went to our marketing team, we had enrolled maybe 4 patients, and then we've gotten up to like 15 in probably a 20% the amount of time that it took us to get 4. So Jeremy, yeah,
What was the goal for enrollment?
20 patients total.
Yeah.
Yeah, we wanted 20 patients total, and after I think it was 6 months, we only had 3 or 4. We said, okay, what we're doing probably is not going to take us to the finish line.
It was an interesting thing because, first of all, I will say it did take a substantial budget to work, but it was really we did like a big a big marketing campaign approach where we did some stuff locally with like the local chamber of commerce, and did some of that more traditional media where we were just putting stuff on local TV spots. But then we were really able to utilize some of our digital marketing partners to really go in and target the right types of patients. So Dr. Curry mentioned that it was 4 patients with breast cancer and colorectal cancer. So I sat with Dr. Curry and we talked about what that meant and what kind of chemos that those people were on. And we picked out the 2 specific chemos that they were most likely going to be on. And then we used some data tracking to be able to target patients that had been on those specific types of chemo. So then we were making direct reach outs to people who had been on those chemos that we were looking to enroll in the trial. So it was really kind of an interesting way to, instead of just, your traditional is usually, you hear those late night commercials on TV or on the radio telling you to like participate in a trial. And really, when we looked at the data and the numbers and the amount of people that we were trying to get in the trial, we didn't need a lot, but like there weren't that many in the region to begin with. Like we have a lot of people that have had cancer, but whittling it down to the exact time, it ended up being like a couple thousand people in the Cincinnati region that could possibly get into this trial. But with the marketing approach and the digital marketing targeting, we were able to actually speak to those patients, and I think that's why it was so successful so quickly.
Absolutely.
And all of these trials are woven together through this BXQ350 drug. So, can you go into kind of the structure of BXQ350 and talk a little bit about what the drug is doing?
Sure. It is a nanovesicle, so a very small drug, and it uses a lysosomal protein known as sapsin C. It's packaged in a phospholipid, which is structures that are similar to what covers our cells, and it's injected into the bloodstream. And the belief is that the lysosomal protein, when it hits cancer cells, it will change the metabolism of the lipids inside the cell to potentially increase something known as ceramide, which is almost like a death signal in cells. So it's trying to kill cancer cells by using its own proteins, et cetera, against it.
And that's a pretty novel treatment.
It is. Yeah, I'm not aware of any drug that is like this one. The mechanism of action is certainly something unique. We're not, they're not recycling other ideas in cancer. I think they're going out on their own with a new approach.
And we'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Katie Westerkamp, Therapeutic Strategy Lead for our cell and gene therapy programs. At CTI, we have multiple centers of excellence. I support our Cell and Gene Therapy Center of Excellence, leading a cross-functional team of resources to enable and support the development of compound lifecycle programs in cell and gene therapy. We have a lot of new and exciting items going on within CTI, innovative solutions to operationalize your cell and gene therapy studies, and we look forward to continuing that conversation with you. Please schedule a meeting with us. You can either contact us through the meeting or reach out through our website at www.ctifacts.com.
Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Curry about BXQ350 from Bexion Pharmaceuticals and how CTI is partnered to help them complete their clinical trial.
You've talked about BXQ350, Bexion, CTI, the importance of these trials, but why is cancer research important overall?
I'm sure everybody would agree they know someone related to someone who has had cancer, has cancer, or died of cancer. So that problem's only going to get more common as our population ages and more people enter the cancer diagnosis. So we can't do any better than we do now if we don't have more research. Research has taken us to where we are. I think recently we've done very well in combating cancer, but it's not enough. In my clinic, I treated brain cancer for a long time, and we made little gains, but we certainly are not curing our patients. So in order to get closer to that goal, it's all about research. And I think it's making sure that people understand that research, the benefits of research, I should say, that it's not experimental in the sense that we're doing something to you where we have no idea what we're doing, we're going to hurt you. It's more of we need to use all of this knowledge to our benefit to develop more drugs and develop more therapies for people, and to, I think, empower people to seek out research. I think that's one of the things that I always really appreciated if a patient, their family came to me talking about a clinical trial with interest. I think if we're more interested in research, that it gains momentum. There's, lots of money that needs to be raised, a lot of efforts. So anything we can do to spread the word on it, I think is really important.
Yeah, and getting patients involved so that they can further help advance that research. How did you get involved in oncology research? What was your career progression?
My career, when I came out of medical school, I wanted to be a neurologist. I really liked the puzzle solving of it and thought at first I was going to be a stroke doctor, that I would treat strokes. And through residency, I got exposed to an oncology rotation and very much gravitated towards the patients and their families. I felt like my personality fit, and that made me think, well, if I'm going to be a stroke doctor, how can I do that? And long story short is that neurologists can treat brain cancer. I found that out and was able to do a fellowship in that. And in fellowship, a big part of what we learn is, clinical trials and putting patients on trials and how to get involved with that. So that was my first introduction into cancer research, and then came back here and practiced and was involved in a number of different trials. And then as I started to work with Bexion, because some of my patients were enrolled on their first trial, I got to know CTI. And then that, where I made the career shift to come over here and to work on, research exclusively. And a lot of what I do are on oncology trials.
Yeah. And what is your role as a medical director at CTI? Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, we try to wear a lot of hats. I think at the beginning, we help our team when they find, companies that want to run trials that have oncology-based drugs. So I work with them to better understand the medical aspect. Does this make sense? What else can we provide, and feedback to that? And then if we start to work on a trial, I work kind of hand in hand with their medical representative to make sure that we're enrolling the correct patients, that we're monitoring for safety the best we can. We're looking into clinical signs of, does this drug work? And then on the back end, making sure that all the data is collected properly to interpret what happened and then report that to the FDA. So we try to provide our medical experience to the trial to make sure that what we're developing actually would make sense for a patient someday.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Curry.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you.
Now, let's get over to the second segment with Chad Jones, Senior Director of Clinical Project Management and Therapeutic Strategy Lead for Oncology, and Katie Westerkamp, Associate Director of Clinical Project Management and Therapeutic Strategy Lead for Cell and Gene Therapy. Welcome, Chad and Katie, to the Moving Medicine Forward podcast. We're glad to have you here today. We're talking hematology and oncology. Let's start with you, Chad. What are unique challenges associated with hematology research?
Yeah, so I certainly think it's a differentiated space from solid tumors. There are unique assessments that are associated with that. You also have a patient population that can be widely variable. You have patients that are in very good shape, very healthy. Finding those patients that have progressed, have moved on, and are at a point where they're actually going to be a good candidate for a research project can be challenging. And then at the same time, once they do progress for many of these indications, it can happen very, very rapidly. So as you're moving into cellular therapies, where you may have an autologous product and it's going to take a long time to manufacture that product, you can have some challenges there in actually keeping those patients eligible, keeping them healthy enough to actually participate in the research. And certainly for us, we want to make sure that we're providing that to them as quickly as possible. These can be potentially life-saving, and it's extremely important.
And you talked about getting that treatment to them quickly. How do sites play a role in that? How do you make sure that a site is set up for quick delivery and trial?
Selecting the right site is absolutely essential to this. They have to have the right facilities. They have to have the right background. They have to know the research. Preferably, you're going to want someone that's already administering approved products, so they're very familiar with the logistics involved in that. And again, there just has to be a desire to move very, very rapidly. They have to know that this patient's life is fully dependent on getting this done as quickly as possible.
Katie, how does cell therapy and small molecule research fit into this?
So I think the additional piece to add to how do we move through that process quickly, particularly in the cell therapy programs, is really working with the sites and understanding when the manufacturing slots are available, because that really is the largest constraint in scheduling the patients. We're really dependent on when can their apheresis product be shipped to manufacturing. And then while it is in manufacturing, working with the physicians to put together that plan of what is going to be their bridging therapy to keep that patient stable until their product is available. So those are all things that we work with the sites on and kind of putting together that patient journey so that everything is step by step planned out.
How are sites, these academic centers are becoming overwhelmed by patients. So I want to talk to you about that piece of it, and then how the cell therapy comes into play and how we can utilize community centers while making sure that the cell therapy component is being appropriately utilized.
Yeah, yep, understand. So it's a unique challenge that we have right now, and that those sites are very much so inundated by patients, by research. They really don't have the resources all the time to manage additional studies. We have to find ways to get around that, and that really means that we need to start relying on community centers. And if that means that we need to develop those community centers where they have the ability to manage these studies, then that is something that we certainly need to focus on as an industry, not just CTI individually, but as a whole. We need to help this to be available or more available to a more diverse patient population.
What things need to be rolled out in order to get community centers up and running? I know we've talked about how a lot of the academic sites have the appropriate
Cell culture labs.
Yes, cell culture labs.
They have the ability to apherese. There's a lot of different things that they need there. Even community centers usually have some sort of an affiliation with local hospital systems that you could potentially utilize for the apheresis portion of an autologous product, trying to get those cells from the patient initially. I think another part here is really just training. Because of the fact that they're community centers, they probably have not administered cell products in the past. And so you may have a talented investigator there, a talented physician, very capable, but just hasn't had the opportunity to participate in a study like this. This gives them that opportunity, if we're willing to work with them, develop them, have sponsors that are willing to go along with us in developing these sites, so that we, again, tap into a more diverse patient population and get around some of the resourcing constraints that we have at academia.
And I think in addition to that is really preparing those physicians for the safety events that will come after administration and really putting together some safety management guidance ahead of being able to administer the drug.
How can CTI help with some of that safety management preparation for these sites?
So from a training perspective, we have several guidance documents put together based off of the research that is out there today. Each individual product is unique, and the safety profile will be different. But I think we do have a general sense of what are the typical adverse events that we'll see, such as ICANN, CRS, and be able to provide some initial guidance along with the sponsor based off of their development of their drugs. So working with the physicians and the nursing staff to ensure that they have the appropriate drugs available to administer should an event occur would be important.
So where have you seen it going well in your day-to-day with some of the sponsors that we work with? Give us an example of something that has gone well in utilizing some of these processes.
So I think one thing that CTI has really put in place with the cell therapy sponsors during the site initiation is conducting a dry run, bringing all of the functional teams together at the hospital and working with them to define what that process will look like for them. We have a general process of where everything is going to go and what are those steps, but we need to layer in the site processes on top of that. So we bring in the site coordinators, we bring in the apheresis nurses, the cell therapy lab, the physician, and how are all of those teams working together to move the product through the institution into manufacturing and then back for administration.
So it sounds like a lot of training. A lot of training has to go into it for these very complex trials.
A lot of training. I think that our previous experience in cellular therapies really helps us to get there. I also would be remiss not to mention that we have medical expertise in-house as well that also leads us in the right directions, helps us to avoid any issues that may come up or any kind of potential risk that we may not have identified or experienced in a previous study. Our medic can help us to get through that and steer us in the right direction.
What are some key lessons learned that you now implement moving forward on trials?
I think it's more of an awareness than anything else. Certainly we have tools that are specific for administering cellular therapies, but things like vendors and understanding that not all vendors perform the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not saying that one performs better than the other. They just have different ways of doing business. Being aware of that, keeping an eye on them, tracking, I think obviously tracing products from the site to the manufacturer and then back to the site. That is absolutely critical to this because quite often you will have a product that gets lost, not necessarily lost, but it falls off of its schedule. And that product is not only valuable, it's not only expensive, it's a life-saving product. And if you don't get that to your patient may not survive. So very, very important.
Is this our community wanting to move and take burden off of academic centers and moving towards more community centers? Is it something that we're actively working towards? Is this just an industry push that's needing to happen, but it hasn't occurred yet? It sounds like there's a lot of training involved and a lot of collaboration, that tracking and such.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something we're actively working towards, or?
So we are. And so I think collaboration is the best word for that.
Yeah.
It's not just us talking to the sites, it's us also talking to our sponsors and finding sponsors, again, that are willing to go down this road with us to help us to develop those sites so that they can do these studies. I do want to back up here because it's not just about resourcing. It's not just about academia having all of these. It's also, I want to sort of touch on diversity again, right?
Yeah.
The industry as a whole is highly reliant on academia, and academia forces patients to go to a central location to receive these therapies. Not all patients are able to, and those that are maybe economically restrained do not get that opportunity. So by going to community centers, building those community centers up where they can do these studies, we're then making it possible for those patients to receive the same level of care as those folks that are maybe more financially stable.
Where do you see this kind of going in the future? Like obviously this, like some of the cell and gene therapy stuff is relatively new as far as the science goes. Like, do you see like a massive shift in our culture? Like, does it I mean, obviously moving things to the community centers and stuff is going to help with that, but like, where do you see it going in the future?
I think we can see in the last 5-7 years the several approvals in cell and gene therapy. So I think that's very positive, and those approvals are in rare disease and hematological cancer indications. And I think we're going to see a kind of shift into more common diseases with greater patient numbers. And in that case, the academic centers will find it difficult to maintain that level of patient care. And so reaching into the community centers really kind of broadens our patient population, not only with diversity, but when we're talking about things like type 1 diabetes, that affects the entire population. And so how do we get those patients involved in these therapies, life-saving therapies or life-changing therapies?
And Chad, you haven't talked about it today, but I know previously you've talked about how we're getting to a point where no patient has this, we lump these types of diseases together, but each patient is unique. So can you talk to that, and then how sponsors are addressing that, how sites are addressing that?
I think this is sort of like any therapeutic. We're at the very early stage of cellular therapies, and so you're trying to see what you can do to affect the most patients at the same time. And what that means is you have a very broad approach to it. I think this will become more targeted, even more precise. You'll see, what the full mutational status is for these patients and how a drug or a combination of drugs can potentially affect their efficacy there. Cellular therapies are no different. I see them being combined with other immunotherapies, there's small molecule therapies, just anything that's combined. Again, combination therapies are very popular right now. I don't think there's going to be any lack of new immunotherapies that are being developed. I also think that ADCs are just all the rage right now.
In the landscape of hematology and oncology, what are some of key recent discoveries, and where do you see the trends moving in the coming years?
Well, I think that right now there's a tremendous amount of activity. You certainly don't see as much in hematology as you do in solid tumors, but just having returned from ASH, it is alive, especially in the cellular therapy space. I don't think that there's any lack of interest here, and certainly everyone sees the value in it. I think this is the first time that we've ever really had a product emerge on the market that actually had the ability to cure a cancer, at least in some of these difficult hematological indications. So I don't see this going anywhere. I think this is going to be a growing field.
Thank you, Chad and Katie, for joining us today. And thank you for tuning in. Please be sure to subscribe so you can catch the next episode of Moving Medicine Forward.